So you might think now that it's time to record your podcast and it's ready, set, go, record. No. What we want to make sure is that your episode content, first and foremost, is of good quality, like we talked about in the last episode, but that it has some structure. So that's what this episode is about here. Let's roll the titles. Brand My Podcast. This is a show for podcasters to start your podcast with confidence and elevate your voice to give your listeners a brand they can connect with. Brand My Podcast. G'day and welcome back to Brand My Podcast. I am your host, Frank, and I'm especially excited for today's episode. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll notice that you'll see a bit of a different mic setup here. I have now the Rode Pod mic coupled with the Rodecaster Pro, and I'm gonna call myself out. I know last episode I said gear isn't everything. What matters is your content. Yes, definitely. You don't need what I have here, what I have set up here with a pod mic or even a better microphone or this Rodecaster Pro. It's totally overkill, but being a podcaster, this is something that I've wanted to get my hands on for a long time, so I invested in it because I just love this stuff. You probably got that from the last episode if you did listen to episode 8. But I really want to dig in here. I hope this sounds good. It sounds good on my end, doing a bit of testing beforehand. I practiced as I preached. I did an audio test to make sure everything was working fine. And so let's kick in. So this episode is about structuring your podcast episodes. As I alluded to at the start, we don't want to go into our episodes or each episode that we record willy-nilly. We want to plan, we want to have a process, and we want to have a structure for each and every episode. And what that really means is that we have something that our listeners want to come back for and get that same experience time and time again. So if they had a great experience the first time listening to one of your episodes, be it the first, be it the most recent, be it episode number 500, whatever it is, we want to give them that consistent experience. And to do so, we need to create a structure for each and every episode. Now, every podcast is totally different. No two podcasts are typically the same. So we want to come up with a structure that works for you, for what your content is about, and for what you want your listeners to hear. And the best example I can give you is treating your podcast as if it's a news program. So if you watch the nightly news bulletins, they go for anywhere between 30 to 60 minutes, and they're structured. You have the top stories at the start. Before that, though, you're presented with the host of the show. But then after those top stories, you have the more local stories. You have more introspective kind of stories that might go for a bit longer. You might have an interview here or there of a celebrity or of a politician. Then you get into things like sport and weather, and then a recap, and then an outro sign-off from the host, and that's it. So if we follow that same kind of idea, we're not trying to create a news program here, unless your podcast is about news and current affairs. This might be something to mirror a news program. But what we want to do is create a structure that our podcast listeners know what they're going to have coming to them. If they've listened to the first episode, it's going to be all new. But that second episode, if it's a similar kind of format, they know what to expect. So there are some key ingredients of making a podcast. I'm not saying it's a cake or anything like that or your home-cooked dinner, but there are some key things that you typically find for many podcasters that make a podcast what it kind of is. So the ones you're obviously going to know is the intro and outro of the hosts introducing themselves and maybe their guests, and then outroing, saying, thanks so much for listening, I'll see you in the next episode, bye. But then you also have the intro music and even outro music if you have that audio branded podcast. Now, audio branding is something we're going to talk about in a later episode. I'm going to bring on some special guys that do that kind of stuff, but there's that element there to really brand your podcast in a way that is audibly recognized, so that once your audience listen into an episode, they hear that music, they're all automatically brought into that experience that you're offering. In addition to that, you might have a guest introduction. You might do a little bit of a preamble there to introduce your special guest on the podcast to give your listeners some context, or let the guest introduce themselves before you kick into the interview or the chat that you are having. Speaking of that chat or interview, you have that part of your podcast. That's the guts, that's the body of your podcast. Or it's you talking about that specific topic that you're talking about, which is what I'm in at the moment. I am in the body of my podcast episode. Typically, if you're doing a guest episode, you want to have maybe 1 to 5 questions that you ask them, depending on the length of your podcast. By all means, you can ad-lib things here and there to follow up, certain questions, but we want to keep it quite specific to what you want to ask them. Again, we'll get into some episodes about podcast interviews with having guests, but that's mainly your body part of your conversation in the podcast. Then you kind of have the where can you find more info about either you, your podcast, the service you offer, the business that you have and the products that you sell, or about the guests that you've had on the show, where to find them on Instagram, LinkedIn, their website, all that kind of stuff. And then you might want to introduce as well a call to action. And there's many different ways that you can do this, which is kind of similar to what I just mentioned before, especially if you're a business owner and you want to have people go to your website to engage with your services or products. Or if you're a personal brand and you want people to interact with your social media handles and engage with your content or DM you, they're call to actions. Another call to action is to encourage your listeners to ask them to leave reviews on Apple Podcasts, for instance, or to send you an email with any feedback or anything that they wanted to share with you as a result of listening to that podcast episode. Having something for them to walk away and do. They might not do it, but that's something that you can add as a part of your structure in your podcast. It's something that I do at the end of my episodes, each and every episode. And I make it a habit of doing that, so that way at the end of that episode, you know what you're going to get. You might skip it, I don't know, but there's that call to action there at the end. And then there's one extra bit that a lot of podcasters do, especially if you've built up an audience and you want to then monetize your podcast in a way. You can add in sponsored messages from advertisers or from specific brands that sponsor that episode of your podcast. They give you a bit of money, paid per shout out basically. Or there might be an affiliate connection that you have with a certain product that you want to give them a shout out in return for having commissions on sales. And that's something that you can do to monetize your podcast. The other way you could even do it is to have your podcast sponsored by your own business and use that as a plug to talk about your products and services, just like I mentioned in the last couple of examples of what can make up the structure of your podcast. So there's some typical bits and pieces about what kind of structure you could have. There are a whole multitude of other things that we could talk about, things like Q&A sections with your audience, or having bite-sized segments that might be with several different guests. Whatever it might be, your podcast is unique to you. So the tip here is to really figure out a structure that works for you, something that maybe is unique and brings back people more and more and more, time and time again, to have that same experience. Now, as I said, creating a consistent experience creates a consistent listenership over time. It's what brand building really is. You go into a hairdresser and you have had that most amazing experience of getting your hair cut. You come out looking glam and absolute fire with either your short back and sides like myself, or you have that beautiful new bangs going on if you're a lady and you've had your hair done with a whole new style. And that experience just wowed you. The people were lovely. The decor was lovely, all these kind of things that make up that branded experience that business owner has put some time and effort and love into, making sure that you come back for more. That's what we want to do for our listeners. So in that hairdresser, if you go back there and the experience was a bit different, are you more likely to keep going back because you're looking for that same experience you had the first time? And if you're not getting the same experience again that you're looking forward to, then there's some disconnect and it feels a bit disjointed and you're not too sure what you are going to get. So try and make a point of structuring your episode in a way that might not have to be so rigid and so evident that this is segment 1, this is segment 2, this is segment 3. We want to keep it fluid, but have some semblance of some structure there. And this isn't to say that you can't mix things up either. By all means, every 5 to 10 episodes, you could mix up your structure to keep your podcast fresh, new and engaging. Maybe keep your audience on their toes a little bit. They might appreciate something new being added or some things being flipped around in different, order. Whatever it might be, you have the ability to mix things up. Just don't do it every episode, I guess. So it doesn't feel like a hodgepodge mishmash of things every episode, and it doesn't sound like you're making things up as you go. We want to show that you are the professional that someone wants to listen to and needs to listen to if you have something of value to deliver. Be it entertainment or, something serious. Keeping that structure still helps that listener know what they're in for and want to come back for more if you give them a great experience that first time and then every time after. Some examples of podcast structures. One of my own podcasts, I have a title sequence that starts first, so that audio branding to begin with, and then I have an intro to my guest, and then I have the guest interview, then I do an outro about them, and then it's a bit of a call to action to have more people on the show as guests, leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, and then saying we'll see you in the next episode. That's my episode structure for Two Red Chairs. For this particular podcast, you'll obviously notice that I get on for a little bit of a tiny bite-sized teaser intro to give some context about what this episode is going to be about. I roll my intro title music or titles that you see on YouTube, and then we launch into a bit of an introduction about the topic, why I'm talking about this. And then we get into the guts of it. I might leave you with a tip at the end, and then we go into the last call to action kind of stuff with a sign-off and then some outro music. There are a whole heap of different ways you can do things. And specifically with things like affiliate or sponsored messages, knowing when to put them in your podcast can differ from how you feel that your listeners will respond to it. Pat Flynn, for example, he puts his sponsored messages right at the beginning. So they're right there that if you're not interested in what he's selling or promoting or giving away, you know that you can skip ahead that little bit if you want to, if you know that structure that he offers. Whereas a fellow designer friend of mine, Ian Paget, his Logo Geek podcast, he has sponsored messages a bit at the start, and then he comes back and talks about that particular offer during the middle of the podcast, so it gives a bit more detail about it and why he might use it or advocates for it, and then launches back into the interview that he has with his guests to kind of break up that interview section a bit and make it much more professional. I mean, that's the perception that I get. It feels much more professional in the way that he structures his podcast purposefully. I don't know why I said that really long and drawn out, but purposefully. So the guts of the episode is having a plan, a process, and a structure for your podcast episodes. There's many benefits to it in that it gives you the confidence and the clarity of stepping up to the mic and knowing what you're going to talk about. But also in post-production, you know how to edit your episode, or your editor, if you have one, knows how to edit your podcast to the way that your style needs to be without having to figure out what to do or making stuff up, each time. It takes out that guesswork. It makes it structured for you, but also for your listener to know what they're in for. So with that, here's my call to action here of if you want to find out more about this podcast, head to brandmypodcast.com and get in touch if you need some podcasting services to create your cover art or structuring your episodes, coming up with a topic that you want to talk about, or even your naming, maybe even a website and social media content. I'm happy to help you out there. So brandmypodcast.com, or you can catch up with me on Instagram at G'dayFrank. But in addition to that, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, I know a lot of you do. I think about half the audience that listens to this is on Apple Podcasts. I would really appreciate a review or a testimonial on Apple Podcasts there. It might only take you 5 seconds. It might take you a minute. That feedback is really appreciated, and it might also bring some other people on board to listen to this podcast, and you'll be helping me out just as much as someone who needs to hear some of this information to start their podcast, just like I'm sure you are about to as well. Until the next episode, it's going to be episode 10. I will see you in the next episode.